Thank you for everybody braving the Scottish weather that we have with our great partners from St. Andrews. I know that the traffic is challenging today, so thank you for all being here. And at this conference, our timing will be flexible today. As Professor English said, this is a civilized conference, and so we have plenty of time to discuss some deep and important issues. Before I turn it over to Professor English, I'd like to welcome everybody on behalf of Georgetown and St. Andrews. Just a couple admin announcements. As always, please put your cell phones on vibrate. I think everybody's found the restrooms that are just around the corner here. We will have our first session this morning from 10 to 12, and then followed by lunch, which will be down the stairs in the lobby down in the basement there, and we'll have a buffet for lunch there. So I'd like to, again, welcome everybody, and I will turn it over to Professor English.
Thanks very much indeed, David. It's great to be back in Georgetown again and to be involved in this wonderful conference on the future of terrorism, co-sponsored by Georgetown University's Center for Security Studies and by the Handa Center for the Study of Terrorism and Political Violence, of which I have the privilege to be director. I'm delighted that a couple of my colleagues from CSTPV are here with me for the conference. And I'm really impressed by the way that Professor Hoffman, who has the responsibility for and the credit for putting this together, has brought together experts from St. Andrews, from Georgetown, and from other places to discuss this global challenge that we all face. Professor Hoffman co-founded in 1994 the Center for the Study of Terrorism and Political Violence at the University of St. Andrews, and he's been a long-standing friend of the program at St. Andrews. In recent years, we've managed to develop a good relationship between the two centres, including exchanges which have been wonderful, which have brought some marvellous Georgetown students to study with us at St. Andrews. I can see a few of them in the room here today, and it's great to have this conference as the next stage in that process and collaboration. In regard to that, I'd like to thank, as well as thanking Professor Hoffman and his colleagues, also thank the George T. Colaris Intelligence Studies Fund, which has provided some of the funding to make it possible to be here today. It's a real privilege to chair our first session, which is on current and future threats, and to introduce to you our three distinguished speakers. What I'm going to do is introduce the three speakers, and then each of them will speak for around 20 minutes. I will take all three talks, and then we'll move to questions, answer, and discussion after they've spoken. Our first speaker is Sir David Veness. David is an honorary professor at CSTPV at the University of St. Andrews and has deep and long experience of studying, analysing, interpreting, and responding to terrorism and the challenges of counter-terrorism. Cambridge educated, he was formerly Assistant Commissioner at New Scotland Yard, and also spent a period as Under-Secretary General at the UN Department of Safety and Security between 2005 and 2009. Awarded the Queen's Police Medal in 1994, he was appointed CBE in the year 2000 and knighted in 2004. Our second speaker is also a very distinguished analyst of terrorism and counter-terrorism, Professor Christine Fair of Georgetown University here in the Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service. Educated at the University of Chicago, her research focuses pioneeringly and brilliantly on South Asia. Books including Treading on Hallowed Ground, Counterinsurgency Operations in Sacred Spaces, published in 2008, Counterinsurgency in Pakistan, published in 2010, and the brilliant study Fighting to the End, the Pakistan Army's Way of War, published in 2014. If you haven't read Professor Fair's books, then shame on you. Normally at events like this I publicise my own, but I'm actually acting as the agent for other people today. Okay. It's one of the privileges of studying this topic that you come across people. I've only just met Christine today in person, but I've met her ideas for a long time, and you come across scholars who discover all this stuff, which makes you realise how little you know about the world. But in my case, I've learnt far more about the world in terms of the area she studies through her brilliant scholarship. Our third speaker is Professor Bruce Hoffman, Director of the Center for Security Studies here at Georgetown, and the world's preeminent scholar of terrorism and counterterrorism for many years. His classic study, Inside Terrorism, remains essential reading for anybody who wants to understand that protean subject. But also his book Anonymous Soldiers, published in 2015, a pioneeringly brilliant and I think now definitive study of the Jewish terrorism which led to the foundation of the State of Israel midway through the past century. And his co-edited tome, The Evolution of the Global Terrorist Threat, is a landmark collection of essays on the recent development of jihadist terrorism and the need to understand its various contexts as they've evolved in recent years. He's the editor of the leading journal Studies in Conflict and Terrorism and the author of many articles of high importance on the subject of terrorism and counterterrorism. He's also had a leading role in being a government-level advisor on counterterrorism. Oxford educated, as I say, he founded the Centre for the Study of Terrorism and Political Violence at the University of St Andrews in 1994, where he used to work and where he still has a strong involvement with us. So it's a privilege to introduce David and Christine and Bruce, and I'd like you now to show a warm welcome to our first speaker, who's going to speak on the subject of A Tale of Three Cities. I'm going to hand over to Sir David Veness.
Thank you very kindly, Richard, for such a flattering introduction. I wish my mother was here to hear it. Again, to Bruce for making this event possible. We're delighted to be your guest, Bruce, and enormously proud of the linkages between St Andrews and Georgetown. Thank you to you and your team. I'm given the task of addressing current and future threats, so I've entitled this short presentation A Tale of Three Cities, with due contrite apologies to Mr. Charles Dickens, the author of the rather more reputable version. These three cities are Paris and Brussels as seen from London. Both Paris and Brussels as we know, have seen dire attacks in recent weeks. An attack in London is rated as highly likely. First, a word about your unworthy author. My role in counterterrorism began in 1979 when I was trained as a terrorist hostage negotiator, and the first international terrorist operational task was at the Iranian embassy siege in April-May of 1980, excuse me, at Prince's Gate in London. I mention that because it's 36 years ago this next week since that event. And as Richard has mentioned, in the years that followed, I headed specialist operations at Scotland Yard and founded the new Department of Global Security for the United Nations, UNDSS. Nowadays, I'm very privileged to support the great work of Richard and his team at St Andrews, and also in London to chair committees and boards which focus upon public-private partnership to enhance safety and security. So from this perspective, the development in threat perception in Paris, Brussels and London since last November, indeed the 13th of November, has in my view been unprecedented and is a dire negative step change. I'm very conscious that the imprint of terrorism, acts of terrorism, take place across the globe. And in recent months, tragically, in San Bernardino, shooting and attempted bombing on the 2nd of December. I see our task to minimize the number of victims of terrorism that tragically will occur in the future. My analysis that I put before you is that the current threat is different and worse from our previous experience of the dangers of international violent jihadist extremism. More authoritative than my view, this analysis is echoed much more eloquently by leading operational practitioners. Let me refer to the comments of the current and immediately former Director Generals of the UK Security Service, known as MI5. Jonathan Evans said, I was cautiously optimistic when I retired that we were winning against Al-Qaeda and other terrorist attacks. It seemed to me we were making significant progress. Regrettably, and he writes in 2015, subsequent events have proved my judgment to be wrong. Linked to Jonathan Evans' assessment is the impact of the geography of contemporary terrorism, both in real territory and in virtual territory, and in a spread geographically across Africa, North Africa especially, South Asia and elsewhere. The current Director General of MI5, Andrew Parker, emphasized the Syrian dimension of this threat, referring to 20 plots that have emanated since 2013 from Syria, and acknowledging that we know that terrorists in Syria harbour the same ambitions towards the United Kingdom, trying to direct attacks against our country and exhorting extremists to act independently. Later last year, Andrew Parker spoke again at the Lord Mayor's Defence and Security lecture entitled A Modern MI5. This was in the end of October last year. Sadly, his remarks were to prove perceptive and precedent. He stressed the complexity of the threat, stating, "Today we face a three-dimensional threat, at home, overseas and online. An increasing proportion of our casework links to Syria and to ISIL. Even 3 years ago, when Jonathan Evans gave this lecture, we could not have predicted how the ISIL phenomenon has developed since. More than 750 extremists from this country," he's referring to the UK, "have travelled to Syria, and the growth in the threat shows no sign of abating." He emphasised, in a range of attacks in Europe and elsewhere this year, we've seen greater ambition for mass casualty attacks, and all of this underlines the growing threat we face. He underlined and reinforced the unprecedented scale and tempo of these developments and said, "This threat may not yet have reached the high water mark, and despite the successes we've had, we can never be confident of stopping anything." Tragically, he was speaking at the end of October last year. Dire events in swift succession confirmed his warning comments. On the 31st of October, a Russian civilian airliner was downed by terrorist action over Egypt. A Daesh-associated group claimed the bombing. All on board, over 220, were murdered. On the 12th of November 2015, suicide bombs killed 40 in Beirut, Lebanon. And then on the 13th of November, concerted brutal attacks were mounted in Paris at diverse commercial and entertainment venues, killing over 130 people. The Paris attacks were claimed by Islamic State, or Daesh, with a threat that further attacks would follow. The first major attack by Daesh in a major Western European city included a range of attack methods delivered with great savagery over a short time span. John Brennan, the director of the CIA, speaking in this city about the same time at CSIS in November, referred to the external operations agenda for ISIL or Daesh, and he asserted that he certainly did not consider that the Paris attack was a one-off event. And indeed, the British government document, which makes the case for airstrikes in Syria, contains the comment, "ISIL has dedicated external operations structure in Syria, which is planning mass attacks across the world." That was the memorandum from the Prime Minister in November last year. I've asserted to you that the current threat is markedly different from what has gone before, especially as seen from Paris, Brussels and London. What are the key factors of difference? I submit that they include scale, resourcing, agility and methodology. Scale encompasses terrorist acts reinforced by foreign fighters, as well as the geography of electronic reach. Scale is also linked to the so-called caliphate in what used to be Iraq and Syria on the Sykes and Picot model. The occupation of territory is both an advantage and a vulnerability. The reduction of the advantage is regrettably a long-term prospect. Daesh has a rallying cry of staying and expanding, or enduring and expanding. Expansion has taken place in provinces or wilayats and affiliated groups, notably in Sinai, Egypt, in Libya, Nigeria, and elsewhere. And whilst Western Europe is not a Daesh province, the Paris and Brussels attacks indicate the presence of a significant support network. The provision of weaponry, explosives, suicide vests, transport, safe houses, bomb factories, and funding eluded disruption and detection prior to the Paris attacks in November 2015. Scale is linked to proximity, particularly to Western Europe. The eastern and southern shores of the Mediterranean Sea provide departure points to mainland Europe. Turkey borders directly with Syria and Iraq. Scale operates against the background of mass movement of refugees and internally displaced persons fleeing violence and instability. This enormous human tragedy awaits effective, concerted European action to alleviate the continuing distress of many thousands. Next, resourcing is based upon extortion, theft and kidnapping, amongst other tactics, plus capture of sophisticated state weaponry. Provides an extensive range of malevolent options which stretch from warfare through insurgency to terrorism. The boundaries between political violence and serious and organized crime have been further eroded, although this creates a response opportunity which I think could be further developed by more imaginative and dynamic international cohesion and cooperation. Daesh has made vigorous use of communication, especially social media, more than any of its predecessors. Propaganda, recruitment, provocation, inspiration, instruction and contacts are facilitated for a predominantly youthful international audience. Agility and innovation are features of Daesh modus operandi. Daesh core, the provinces and its networks have proved resilient in the face of the international coalition effort. It is now manifestly clear that Daesh is not a regional threat contained only to the Levant or Sham, although Syria and Iraq remain centres and focal points. Its international agility has resulted in provinces or linkages with varying degrees of formality in Egypt, North Africa, the Sahel, West Africa, the Arabian Peninsula, the Caucasus, Afghanistan and Pakistan. Terrorist events in Tunisia and Libya illustrate these points particularly clearly. In Tunisia, the Tunisian branch of Ansar al-Sharia developed links to Daesh in Syria, and this was in the period leading to the proclamation of the so-called Caliphate in July of 2014. On 18th of March 2015, gunmen attacked the Bardo Museum in Tunis, murdering 22, injuring 50. The tourist dimension of this attack was underlined by the choice of target. 17 of the 22 dead were Western tourists. Again, different attack methods, marauding gunmen, siege and social media propaganda were deployed. Following the Bardo murder attack, the group became a Daesh province, threatening further attacks against Western tourists in retaliation for coalition airstrikes in Syria. On 26th of June 2015, a gunman dressed as a tourist attacked holidaymakers at Sousse on the Tunisian coast. Armed with an assault rifle, he killed 38, including 30 British citizens. 39 people were wounded. On 26th of June, this has now become known as Black Friday because it also involved beheading of a US factory in Lyon, France, and a suicide bombing at a Shia mosque in Kuwait. 27 were murdered in Kuwait and 227 were wounded. And whether or not these acts were formally coordinated, the impact was exacerbated by the simultaneous effect. Tourism is a predictably consistent target. The presence of Western tourists, especially in locations popular with coalition state citizens, provides accessible victims in venues which are very hard to secure. The deployment of Russian assets in Syria highlights this trend. At the same time that Russian forces were deploying in Syria, Russian tourists were on vacation at Red Sea resorts. The outcome was the downing of a Russian civilian airliner on the 31st of October, Metrojet Flight 9268. From a European viewpoint, Libya is a very high priority in terms of the Daesh threat. It looks north to Italy and Greece, but neighbours 6 countries: Tunisia, Algeria, Egypt, Chad, Niger, and Sudan. Daesh has exploited the post-revolutionary chaos of Libya. Daesh now has a Libyan affiliate comprised of Libyan and non-Libyan fighters. Daesh Corps has provided advice and support. The group has conducted a range of attacks, including a prestigious hotel, oil facilities, and oil workers. The most repellent events have involved the mass murder of Christians. 21 Egyptian Copts were executed by beheading in February 2015 on the beach of the Mediterranean shore. 30 Ethiopian Christians were murdered in April 2015, and this included a beach, again, beheaded on the beach. The prolonged political and economic schisms that have plagued Libya for so long may have been partly resolved by a diplomatic deal in December last year, and the recent arrival of a government of national accord in Tripoli at the end of March may be a cause for hope. This may, with international assistance, assist the internal security of Libya, and that the opportunity for Daesh agility will hopefully reduce. But this is heavily dependent on great will and commitment at global, regional, and national levels. The methodology of international jihadi extremism includes complex attacks at a wide range of targets. Extreme ferocity and brutality are consistent hallmarks. The threat range is broader and different from previous terrorist campaigns. At the most basic is the call aimed at inspiring and provoking attacks with whatever means of causing harm is at hand, such as a knife or a meat cleaver. In September 2015, Mohammed al-Adnani called for attacks across the world by homegrown terrorists using their own means and choosing their own targets. Bombing and shooting remains, however, prevalent. An example was the murder of 4 people at the Jewish Museum in Brussels in 2014. The murderer was an associate of one of the recent Brussels airport suicide bombers just last month, and both of those individuals had acted as hostage jailers in Syria previously. The Paris attacks presented a combination of suicide bombing, marauding gunmen. These are not just active shooters, I would describe them as ultra-active shooters, also deployment of IEDs and siege tactics. It would be wise, I think, to plan on the prospect of even more innovative and impactful terrorist methodology designed to optimize public fear and to bring the tactics and methods of urban warfare to Western cities, particularly the capacity of IEDs. One of the most challenging aspects of the varied methodology of Daesh is that the threat and the difficulty of response is made much more difficult by what I describe as cumulative threat enhancement. This means that no previous method is deleted when other methods are added. Thus, homegrown terrorists, perhaps acting alone or in pairs, then small groups, and now complex attack plots. All of these need to be addressed at the same time. This breadth of dangers is another feature of the difference between what has gone before. And although the growth of Daesh is a major dimension, Daesh, of course, does not represent the totality of the menace of international jihadist violent extremism. Although it grew out of al-Qaeda in Iraq, AQI, and the relationship between emergent Daesh and AQ has already passed through severe stages. And whatever the future trajectory, whether it's rivalry and competition, or eclipse or merger, the continued presence of AQ is a relevant factor in the overall threat. This includes their affiliates and allies. Al-Shabaab attacked the Westgate Mall in Nairobi in 2013. The Charlie Hebdo murders in January 15 in Paris were carried out by the Kouachi brothers claiming to act on behalf of AQ in the Arabian Peninsula, AQAP. and AQ has provided victims various major attacks launched by AQAP against international targets. In sub-Saharan Africa, AQ has conducted a series of recent attacks, either acting alone or with associates. In Bamako, Mali, on 20th of November last year, Al-Mubataroun, together with AQIM, besieged the Radisson Blu Hotel, taking 170 hostages, of whom 20 were murdered. On the 15th of January this year, the same combination of groups attacked the Splendide Hotel and the Cappuccino Cafe in Ouagadougou, the capital of Mali. A siege unfolded, 30 were murdered, 56 wounded. On 13th of March this year, AQIM claimed the deadly attack at the Grand Bassam resort in Côte d'Ivoire, aimed at 3 hotels at that beach resort. 6 gunmen conducted a marauding attack, killing 16. And these events have contributed to a much greater investment by nations, international organizations, and business companies in travel arrangements for their travelers, due to the very large number of overseas visitors who were embroiled in these regrettable incidents. An aspect of my tale of 3 cities, which I submit is instructive for counter-terrorists, is to analyze not only the enhanced threat posed by terrorists, but to evaluate the consequences of attack when threat becomes grim reality. The UK has a well-defined CT strategy. Name contest, it has 4 Ps: prevent, pursue, protect and prepare. The current scale of threat, especially in relation to its target range and its span of attack methodologies, places an enormous burden on prevent, but particularly pursue. There is no public sector investment which can comprehensively contain the danger. The available public sector staff, intelligence and security agencies and law enforcement are formidably stretched to disrupt attacks across an ever-widening range, always aware of the menace of a deadly attack. In the UK, there's a commendable network of counter-terrorist security advisors, CTSAs, working as a partnership between police and the security service. Their original role was mainly to advise the private sector on perimeter security, access controls, security of materials that could be used by terrorists, such as fertilizer, other chemicals, radioactive materials, and commercial storage facilities. Due to the burgeoning consequences of real attacks and the plots that I have described, this tasking list now includes transport facilities, including metros and all forms of underground railways, local politicians, all crowded places, soldiers and police officers, sports grounds, concert halls, theatres, bars, cafes and restaurants, and indeed tourist venues overseas, including airports. And whilst this demanding list is energetically addressed, it's against the background that Daesh has the resources to detect yet other vulnerabilities and to further expand its targets accordingly. The imperative to prevent, disrupt or detect the next terrorist plot inevitably draws the expertise of current counterterrorism in their resources, particularly in Europe, towards immediate life-saving activity. The focus is on frontline offence. Policy development, future operational preparedness and strategic analysis are inevitably not immediate priorities and regrettably can often be postponed. It's this imprecise field that I think the terrorist studies community could play a useful, relevant and vitally important role if it organised to do so. And besides the security resources being overstretched, or I hear their bosses described it, maxed out by unremitting demand, there are broader consequences of the enhanced threat. In Paris, since November last year, the immediate economic and business impact was severe. Restoration of normality took weeks, and a state of emergency remains in place to this very day. There was a negative impact on social cohesion and a different public reaction to the aftermath of the Charlie Hebdo attacks in January. Both Charlie Hebdo and 13th of November prompted an expectation that further attacks would occur. Concern over safety and security increased significantly, especially in commercial venues to which there is ready public access. The availability of certified security guards was exhausted in Paris within 48 hours of the attacks. Businesses which proved most resilient were those with well-defined and activated business continuity plans. Corporate leadership, in particular, proved an important asset in staff confidence and reassurance. And I submit we've not yet fully exhausted the benefits that can flow from public-private partnerships. During my experience of security in many countries, whilst working at the United Nations, I came to the very firm conclusion that the greatest barrier to effective response to security threats, including terrorism, was and is the relative absence of capability and capacity. Furthermore, the relative absence was most pronounced in the locations where it was most needed. The failing states or lawless zones provide the most compelling examples. The stark lesson, however, of Paris and Brussels is that the problem is not restricted to failing states or hostile environments. The activities of AQ, which continue, are a challenge to the security efforts of most nations. Daesh presents a different challenge to even the most sophisticated states in terms of responses to maximize public safety against a different danger. Let me draw my tale of three cities towards its end. I would offer you some concluding thoughts. I argue strongly that the threat is different from that which has gone before. I submit there are significant gaps in our responses, despite the unfailing efforts, particularly of those engaged in public sector agencies. There are gaps to be found at the global, regional, and national level. The gaps are strategic, they're operational, and tactical. Communications weaknesses are a feature of most gaps, but capacity and capability remains the key. Public and private sectors do not optimize their respective contributions to safety and security. The terrorist studies community, I suggest, has a serious analytical role to play and a vital contribution to make to explain and to advocate the case for the very best responses to a different terrorist attack. The timing of this needed academic contribution, I submit, could hardly be more urgent. Thank you very much for your time and attention.
David, thank you very much indeed. Now to speak on the subject of the likely future of terrorism in South Asia, I'm going to hand over to Dr. Christine Fair.
All right, thank you. This is on, right? Thank you so much. You made me blush. And as Dave Maxwell will tell you, that is hard to do. I'm usually making him blush. So it's a certitude there's going to be terrorism in South Asia. So I'm going to start with Afghanistan. I think that's probably an area where certainly a lot of Americans are interested. I think the biggest development is the emergence of ISIS or ISIL, whatever your preferred moniker is, as well as the rebranding of Al-Qaeda under the moniker of Al-Qaeda Indian subcontinent, as well as the ongoing challenges with respect to the Taliban, which are not technically a terrorist group, at least according to U.S. law. Had we had this discussion 2 years ago about ISIS in Afghanistan, I was fairly insouciant about it. South Asia has been and will probably be for the indefinite future sort of Al-Qaeda central, because Al-Qaeda has a very long-standing relationship with Afghanistan and Pakistan. So the idea that it will be easily dislodged is a challenging idea. But for those of you that have taken my South Asia class, and I see a couple of you, one of the things that's really important to understand about the Afghans is that a militant group doesn't actually have to have victory on the battlefield to get Afghan support. Many Afghans will defect to a particular militia in expectation that they may win, because they don't want to be on the other side of the losing team. So if you remember Operation Enduring Freedom, we went in on October 7th, and by December, the Taliban were basically dislodged. And the reason for that is not that a couple dozen dudes decisively defeated the Taliban. It's that in a domino-like effect, Afghans anticipated that we would win, and they didn't want to be on the losing end of that. And so they defected en masse, and the next thing you knew, the Taliban had been routed and sent to Pakistan, or actually fled to Pakistan. But this wasn't because we had a military victory, it's because Afghans, in expectation that we would, defected. So how is this germane to ISIS? So for those of you that have been following the Taliban as they've evolved over the last decade and a half, I would say the Taliban hate the Pakistanis as much as they hate us. And the reason for this, it's math. Many of the older folks have died through battlefield encounters or otherwise. And the new Taliban, the younger Taliban generation that, for example, Antonio Giustozzi writes about so lucidly, they become very, I'm not sure what the right word is without profanity, really exhausted with Pakistan's intelligence, constantly trying to instrumentalize the Taliban for the ISI's end. And so ISIS has given an opportunity for some of these very disturbed, irked Taliban commanders to defect. Well, and the other issue is criminalization. Criminals, by taking on the ISIS banner, can operate with impunity, right? So you have to be very careful when we talk about ISIS in Afghanistan to be very clear what we're talking about. Is it a branded ISIS in the sense that they're communicating directly with al-Baghdadi? I don't think so. But it's not really clear to me that it matters either, because the fundamental issue is the fracturing of the Taliban at a time when the United States is actually trying to find a way to extract itself. The announcement that Mullah Omar has been dead and died, guess where, in Pakistan, and that the ISI was covering it up with the collusion of Mullah Omar's announced successor, Mullah Mansour, has actually made it all the more challenging for the Taliban to keep this unity within the organization. And so I would contest this notion that even on September 11th, the Taliban was a completely coherent organization. You always had commanders like Haqqani, Hekmatyar, that would sometimes choose to ally with the Taliban, and on other occasions choose to defect. So it was more like the example I give with many of these groups is a kaleidoscope. You see the flecks are the commanders. You see one picture today, you shake it, you get a different picture. So I would argue that the Taliban is even more factionalized today than perhaps it's ever been. And the controversial role of Mullah Mansour in covering it up with the collusion of the ISI doesn't make that any easier. Al-Qaeda Indian subcontinent's efforts to relaunch itself, however, have looked kind of lackluster. And those of us that study South Asia, we joke. You know when you're actually rooting for Al-Qaeda and the Taliban that you're really in a bad place. But that's kind of where we are right now. I mean, I'm actually hoping that Zawahiri can bring these fellows back together, because obviously, I can't believe I'm saying it, they're less horrible than ISIS. And you do have to wonder, where was Zawahiri hanging out when he had that epiphany that ISIS is more brutal than Al-Qaeda? I mean, when was setting a dude on fire in a cage more brutal than flying a plane into a building? So be that as it may, I think ISIL in South Asia, should it be more successful, will be much more violent than Al-Qaeda could have imagined. I'm going to turn very briefly, because we can debate about how real ISIL is in Afghanistan, and it's very difficult to discern that empirically, because the places where ISIL seems to be most entrenched are places where it's actually very difficult to go onto the ground now. Nangarhar seems to be where they're strongly rooted. Also, Kunar and Nuristan. What's interesting about Kunar and Nuristan is that Afghanistan on the main has tended to be Naqshbandi, which is a sort of Sufi order. But in Kunar and Nuristan, Salafis had always had a stronghold. So in some sense, this is home for ISIL or ISIS in Afghanistan. It's also not a coincidence that it is in Kunar and Nuristan where Lashkar-e-Taiba, South Asia's South Asia's most important Salafi group has its origins. But I'm going to turn to the Taliban very briefly. The frustration that I've had as a South Asianist is that the United States keeps doing what fails consistently without failure to in fact fail. And that is, we try to fix Afghanistan in Afghanistan. The problem with the Taliban is not in Afghanistan, it's in Pakistan. I think I can say, and I don't think too many people would seriously disagree with me, that if the Afghan Taliban did not have the unmitigated support of Pakistan's intelligence agencies, its military, and indeed if you talk to special operators, they will tell you that on occasion they are shooting at Pakistan's Special Services Group. I want you to understand that. Our special operators are fighting Pakistan's special operators. Now, this would not be surprising if Pakistan were considered to be an enemy. But if you look at all of the stuff, and I wanted to say something else, that Secretary Kerry says about Pakistan, you would not know that Pakistan is anything but our most allied ally. But I want to put some numbers on the table. Pakistan's taken $33 billion of our taxpayers' hard-earned cash, yet almost all of our casualties in Afghanistan, well over 3,000 troops, roughly equivalent number of civilians, not to mention tens of thousands of Afghans in and out of uniform. It's very difficult to get numbers on civilian contractors. I'm sure many of you know that there are more civilian contractors, that is to say, mercenaries. I'm not sure what the polite word is. We used to call them personal security detail. We don't call them that anymore. But there's more PSD, or whatever the new moniker is, presently in Afghanistan than there are active duty troops. So it's very difficult to get numbers on how many of those folks are dead because it's not a reporting requirement. But if they are on a prime contract, OSHA has to report it. So I've been able to track down 1,800 contractors that have been killed. The vast majority of these losses of American and our allies, uniformed and out of uniform, are coming not from Al-Qaeda, not from ISIS, but from Pakistan's proxy, the Taliban. Yet the only thing that we have been able to do with Pakistan has reward it with more F-16s. Apparently under the logic that Pakistan will use these F-16s to go after its own Taliban branch, which I'm going to discuss in a few minutes. We've also given them a Perry-class frigate. Apparently the Pakistan Taliban has a navy. So this is not a new problem. This is an ongoing problem. The Obama administration, unlike the Bush administration, cannot claim to be ignorant of the Pakistan problem. It isn't. Bruce Rydell probably has the same assessment of Pakistan as I do. But it, like the predecessor government, has been unable to crack this nut that we are in Afghanistan and losing because of Pakistan, and yet we only choose policies of appeasement towards Pakistan. I'm going to give you a little bit of an amuse-bouche why that is, because you would argue that with our troop deployments decreasing, we should be in a position to give Pakistan a kick where it amply deserves it, which is, of course, the mouth, right? But in fact, Pakistan has been able to ensure against that through, wait for it, ladies and gentlemen, the proliferation of tactical nuclear weapons. Also, wait for it, they've done this subsidized by, again, our tax dollars. So the things that we fear most, terrorists getting nuclear weapons, we've actually enabled through our ample subsidy to Pakistan. If that's not completely FUBAR, I'm not sure what FUBAR is. But having laid out this problem, let me present a couple of perhaps positive opportunities. And then I'm going to conclude with one more bad thing in Afghanistan. Whatever you think of the Iran deal, and I know there's a lot of controversy about it, the Iran deal, from my point of view, as a South Asianist, presents a lot of opportunity. In fact, for years I said, and my South Asia students will know this, let's do a counterfactual. If on September 11, 2001, we went to war not only with Pakistan on our side, but also Iran. Iran has what Pakistan had, which was a port. And for those of you who don't remember it, Iran was very cooperative. When we launched military activities in Afghanistan, it was very cooperative at Bonn. It was Iran that insisted upon putting democracy in Afghanistan's constitution. It was Iran that said Afghanistan's constitution should recognize the importance of continued counterterrorism operations. Why is that? Because the Iranians hated the Taliban perhaps even more than we did because they lived next to it. In addition to which, the Taliban massacred a bunch of Iranian diplomats/spies. Iran was so pissed off about this, in 1998 it nearly went to war over it, and it was only confused over who it should invade, Afghanistan or Pakistan, because it understood that the ISI was in fact behind this all. So, you know, we could have imagined a very different future. Am I saying that things would have been copacetic with Iran? I'm absolutely not saying that. But our problem with Pakistan is that it was the only way of getting war material through ground lines of communication into Afghanistan. So I was a vehement opponent of the surge, not because I'm you know, military phobic, I'm certainly not, but my argument was that the military surge was 40,000. We had a civilian surge that was not disclosed, but at least 10,000. And the military doesn't do the security for the civilians, PSD did. So we were really looking at, including the NATO contribution to the surge, of another 100,000 people who had to be supported in theater. And all of that material was going through Pakistan. So at a time when we really needed to be in a position to kick Pakistan in the teeth because of its support for the Taliban, we actually put ourselves in a position of greater reliance upon the very country, along with Saudi Arabia, most dedicated to our failures in Afghanistan. This is something that continues to baffle me today because we are no more capable of grappling with this fundamental paradox 15 years later than we were on September 1. And this government cannot say it doesn't have expertise. It does have expertise. It's choosing to ignore expertise, and it's choosing to cherry pick expertise. For example, Pete Lavoie, a good friend of mine, who's never met a Pakistani general he's never liked or thought he could whisper to, right? He's like the general whisperer. You guys don't know the Animal Planet reference, I can't help you. But that's fundamentally our problem with Afghanistan now. It's not lack of knowledge. That was Bush's problem. This is not the Obama administration's problem. It's lack of scrotal fortitude, or if you will, ovarian fortitude. But I would be remiss, although this is not about terrorism per se, but I can't talk about Afghanistan without saying it. We are missing the big picture in focusing upon the military. The real problem in Afghanistan is the economic drawdown. We've insisted upon building the largest rentier state that Afghanistan has never existed like this. Even the Russians did not build a state this large. It cannot pay for even the recurring costs, much less the actual costs. The Americans largely are paying this bill. So when you try to have the discussion of how do we downsize this government, no one wants to have this discussion. No one wants to talk about making this an economically viable entity. Why? Because it's almost as impossible as getting Pakistan to not be perfidious. But I want you to consider what we learned from Najibullah in 1992. When the last Soviet troop withdrew across the Amu Darya, circa 89, Najibullah hung on because the Soviets kept paying the money. When the Soviet Union collapsed and that money wasn't coming through, Najibullah collapsed in 1992. What happened to Najibullah, we all know. It's not a good way to die. In fact, we probably should have been sending pictures to Karzai of Najibullah's corpse disemboweled, hanging on a power line to remind him this is what you could be. And maybe Ghani could benefit from some of those images as well. Right? This is what happens when the pay stops coming in. Why is that? All of those militias that we confederated in making this enormous, unsustainable ANSF will very quickly dissolve back to the militias from which they came if the money does not continue. So what we really need to have is a real discussion about how do we make Afghanistan sustainable, because the Americans are not going to keep paying this bill. It is not South Korea, because anyone will tell you that Pakistan is more dangerous than Afghanistan, and that's where our interests lie. So let me use that, again, bummer, to transition to even a bigger bummer, and that's Pakistan. All right, I don't even know where to begin. Pakistan is like a really hideous onion, and you just keep thinking you're going to get to the center of this hideous onion, and yet there's more hideous onion to go. The problem with Pakistan is that its militant problems, it's not new. It doesn't date to the Soviet Union, as many people are wont to believe. It starts from the earliest action of the independent state of Pakistan. The first thing it did as an independent state was wrestle up a Lashkar we all know, right, a posse, if you will, called them Mujahideen to invade Kashmir. Right, so this is in Pakistan's repertoire from the beginning. Its manipulation of Afghanistan through jihad didn't begin in 79 or 80. It actually began in 1973, long before the Americans even had a clue about what was going on in Afghanistan. So the canard that we roped Pakistan into our jihad is just that, it's a canard. And even before Pakistan began using militant jihad under Zulfikar Ali Bhutto in 73, it laid the seeds for those jihadi groups in the late 50s and 60s by transplanting Jamaat Islami into Afghanistan. Again, as I said previously, Afghanistan, mostly Afghans embrace Naqshbandi Islam. So Jamaat Islami, always an urban organization, it became very active in Kabul and Kabul University. There would not have been the Mujahideen groups had Jamaat Islami not been cultivated by the Pakistanis. So this goes back very, very far. And the reason, by the way, it's really important for you to understand, is not just India. The Afghans were very unwise in the early days of the dissolution of the Raj and the formation of India-Pakistan. Afghanistan was the only country to reject Pakistan's admission to the United Nations. It rejected the boundary, the Durand Line, and there's no support in international law for Afghanistan's position. It also claimed ownership over large swaths of Pakistani territory, inclusive of Balochistan, the federally administered tribal areas, as well as most of what was known as NWFP, now known as Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. Ladies and gentlemen, that's also known as a really bad idea. So as Pakistan's conflict with India continued to evolve, and as India became tied with the Soviet Union, and as the Soviet Union, Russia, then the Soviet Union displaced the Brits as the primary bill payer of Afghanistan, what emerged as an Afghan-Pakistan crisis had the shadow of India overlaid. And today, Pakistan, when it views Afghanistan, it views most of Afghan shenanigans as taking place at India's prompting. So it's very important for you to understand why it is that Pakistan will continue to support essentially, Jurassic savages, even though it's undermining its own state, because from Pakistan's point of view, this is for it an existential fight that it's willing to fight to the end. And you also have to understand how Pakistan views victory and success. Pakistan views failure and defeat as acquiescing to India. So Pakistan will take any number of risks, because taking those risks shows that Pakistan has not acquiesced. So with this really important historical caveat, let's talk briefly about what's going on in Pakistan. It is true that Pakistan has been experiencing since 2002, not 2007, 2002, the emergence of an insurgency. How did this insurgency happen? Well, it's not, when we talk about militancy, Islamist militancy, we tend to refer to them as one thing. It's really important that you understand that there's a collective of different kinds of ideologies that operate in Pakistan. The groups that we mostly talk about are Deobandi, with one important exception. Deobandis are not Salafis. They are in fact Hanafis, so there's a lot of confusion about what these are. And ideology does matter, because they tend to recruit, they tend to have mosques and madrasas that support what they're doing. In other words, there's this ideological infrastructure that supports their actions. So when Pakistan, under President Musharraf, and we now know that with a lot of duplicity, enabled the U.S. to invade Afghanistan, the Deobandi groups, for example, Lashkar-e-Jhangvi, Sipe-Sabe Pakistan, Jaish-e-Mohammed, Huji-Huaham, all of these groups are Deobandi. They had a halalapalooza in Karachi, where they debated, what are we going to do about this? Because Musharraf just enabled the unseating of the only Deobandi Sharia regime, the Taliban. Some of these groups remained loyal to the hand that fed it, Pakistan and the ISI, while others began defecting and turning against the state. These are the origins of what became the so-called Tehrik-e-Taliban-e-Pakistan, the Pakistani Taliban, or the TTP. It's important that you understand that these are Deobandi militant groups, not just random militant groups thrown in. So when Pakistan says we can't be supporting terror, we're the victims of terror, poor us, and they keep generating these magical numbers that cannot be independently confirmed. By the way, they are large numbers. I just don't think they are as large as they say they are, because the numbers they're just not confirmable. But it's important for us to understand that there'd be no Pakistan Taliban had the Pakistanis not supported the Taliban in Afghanistan. They didn't create the Taliban, but they made them a viable, successful military fighting force. By the way, Pakistan's Air Force gave the Afghan Taliban their get up and go. Right? So we're not talking about a few dudes. We're talking about the entire Pakistani military in the 90s was mobilized to support the Afghan Taliban. Right? I hope you all understand this. This was, oh, poor us, we're not doing anything. Nonsense. Their entire military apparatus was reoriented to support the Taliban and help it consolidate Afghanistan, which it did by the mid-1990s. So when Pakistan says, poor us, the Pakistan Taliban, I say to them, no, not poor you. This is called blowback, and it really is a bitch. Right? Because there would be no Pakistan Taliban had there been no Afghan Taliban, had there been no Jaish-e-Mohammed, had there been no Lashkar-e-Jhangvi, and I could go on at length. So this is really blowback. These are groups that used to be proxies that have, for its own reasons, turned against the state. And so let's turn very briefly to Pakistan's military operation, Zarb-e-Azab. For those of you who know Urdu, I call it Zarb-e-Bakwas, Operation Nonsense. Because what it did was, it only undertook this operation after 2 years of U.S. hounding, go after Haqqani in North Waziristan. And by the way, the only thing that finally pushed them to do it was that we held in abeyance 300 million CSF until they actually did it. They're still not getting the CSF because we see through their ruse. What were their ruses? Multiple months of notice. We're coming. No, we're really coming. We really mean it. We're coming. And while they were signaling very vocally on television, through every possible media outlet, on Twitter, we're coming, we really mean it, what they were actually doing was trying to take parts of the TTP and those elements that came in through the Afghan Taliban, convince them to go back to Afghanistan to kill us and our allies. Meanwhile, they had been recuperating Jaish-e-Mohammed, Masood Azhar. By the way, his brother-in-law is responsible for our baggies on the plane. Right? He was the dude behind the airplane conspiracy. And they recuperated Jaish-e-Mohammed so that they could take some of those folks that came from the India jihad and put them back in. So Jaish-e-Mohammed is the group, for example, that just perpetrated the attack back in January on the Indian airfield of Pathankot. Why is that important? That's where we believe India keeps some nuclear assets, right? So this was not just an ordinary attack. This was a big deal attack. And before the Pakistanis went in North Waziristan, it's also very important to know that they relocated the Haqqanis to safe house, right? So this presents what I think economists would call a moral hazard, right? We're paying the Pakistanis to kill terrorists. We're not paying the Pakistanis to extirpate terrorism. In fact, why would they? Because the minute there's no more terrorists in Pakistan, the check stops. Incidentally, this is the same problem that it has with China and the Uyghurs. So if we want Pakistan to be less of a menace, we have to think about how our own policies incentivize the state to do the things that actually disquiet us the most. I've already talked about what they call battlefield nuclear weapons. But let me just say very briefly, there are at least 3 disconcerting and coercive intentions of Pakistan's development of theater nuclear weapons. The first is risk generation with respect to India. Those of you who know South Asia know that Pakistan conducts terrorism with impunity because of its ever-expanding nuclear umbrella. This impunity has 3 dimensions. The first is that it raises the cost of Indian action. Battlefield nuclear weapons, tactical nuclear weapons, which, by the way, we got rid of because we think it's a bad idea, and we believe that the Pakistanis are using our doctrine from the 1950s. The idea, I'm going to say it with a straight face. I'm going to encourage you to listen to it with a straight face. Their doctrine calls to nuke themselves first. Pause, absorb that. Then, when the Indians, this is a warning, don't cross the international border, India. We really mean it because we are so crazy, we just nuked ourselves. When the Indians cross into Pakistani territory, they will then use battlefield nuclear weapons on Indian troops. The idea is that this will then trigger India's second response. And all of this is to get around India's pursuit of a limited war doctrine following the 1999 Kargil crisis. In other words, Pakistan wants to be both East and West Germany. All right? So that's one way in which this is dangerous and scary and irresponsible. The second way in which it's scary and irresponsible, but also coercive, is that the presence of battlefield nuclear weapons shrinks the timeline of international action to respond when Pakistan sponsors a terrorist attack in India. So this is what always happens. Jaish-e-Mohammed, or LET, kills a bunch of people in India. The Americans pick up the phone, hey, India, please appease Pakistan, don't escalate, just suck it up. We'll make the Pakistanis say something nice and you can give that to your people. Well, our ability to disrupt the conflict cycle becomes ever more constricted because theater nuclear weapons shortens that time frame. And so that's part of its purpose. But most dubious, most insidiously, this is what keeps us from taking our check home. Right? Because we fear that if we take our check home, we lose influence. And when you talk to people on the Hill, well, we just can't go home because, you know, those nuclear weapons, and they might fall into the hands of terrorists. But this, again, is a moral hazard. Right? We are subsidizing the things that we find most scary. So we need to find a way to get out of this coercion loop. Let me turn very briefly, because I know I just babbled on and on and on. I'm happy to talk in the Q&A about... Yep, I can, because the other two stories are not nearly as horrible. In the Q&A, if you're interested, I think the fundamental issue with Pakistan is it has a state ideology. And its state ideology encourages this. And so it's not simply an ISI problem or a military problem. If we truly had a civilian control over Pakistan, we would still see the same. And it's a civil society problem. Civil society isn't always civil. So unfortunately, many of these views are not just espoused by the terror-mongering elite, but these are actually grassroots. Families are choosing to send their kids to these organizations. They are so grassroots. Like, my brothers are military recruiters. It's just like walking into a shopping mall and joining the Army National Guard. Indiana Guard, right here. You can go into shopping areas of Lahore and find a recruiter and join a recruiter. That's how grassroots it is. So let me turn very quickly to Bangladesh. Bangladesh, it is the Rodney Dangerfield of South Asia. It gets no respect. I've been following Bangladesh for years. It has always been scary. No one has just focused on it. And there's a lot of reasons why Bangladesh is fertile ground for this ISIS, AQIS competition that we're seeing. One of which is that Bangladesh became an international country after a long struggle with West Pakistan against its Islamist ideology. It was an ethno-nationalist struggle. As Bangladesh became independent, it also became subjected to military coups, because after all, it did inherit the sort of political military outlook of Pakistan. And Bangladesh's military leaders, like Pakistan's military leaders, recuperated political Islam. And so Bangladesh is a deeply divided country. The political parties are deeply corrupt. It's very difficult to forge a consensus on what kind of nation are we, where is Islam in the state, the same kind of problems that affect Pakistan. But I want to give you a cautionary tale. Don't write Bangladesh off. Bangladesh has sent off more fighters to Syria and Iraq than India has. And let me conclude on a bright note. If we were to look at India's characteristics, we have the Hindutva government, which is expressly hostile to Muslims. Muslims, by India's own government documents, are the most discriminated against population in India. I could go on at length about this. We would be expecting India to be churning out ISIS fighters like a factory. Yet it hasn't. It has sent maybe a dozen dudes. Right? So I'm going to end on a positive note. We spend so much time looking at places where terrorism emerges. What makes a country vulnerable? I'm going to argue that we need to look really closely at India, because India is clearly doing something right. India has clearly been resilient. And I'm going to argue that this line of inquiry might be as fruitful as trying to understand why Pakistan is such a producer of terrorists. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much indeed, Christine. And now it's a great pleasure for him to speak on the subject, Is Winter Coming? ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and Terrorism's Terrible Future, to hand over to Bruce Hoffman.
Thank you very much, Richard. I didn't want to be too depressing and say that winter is already here, so I at least pose it as a question to those of you who tuned into the sixth season of Game of Thrones last week, know exactly what I'm talking about. Before I begin, though, let me very much and very profoundly thank Richard, Sir David Veness, Bernhard Blumenau, all for coming over and for helping us to plan this conference. In fact, the idea for this conference came from Sir David Veness about 18 months ago. In St. Andrews, we celebrated in a very successful conference, too, the 20th anniversary of the founding of the Center for the Study of Terrorism and Political Violence. And Sir David was remarking that the situation is getting so bad, and in both of our capitals, the understanding of the dimensions of how dire things are becoming is really absent. And he suggested that we convene a conference in Washington to address these issues. So that was really the genesis. So thank you very much. There's one element to this conference that I think will make it unique in the annals of terrorism. I mean, there are many terrorism conferences that have been represented by new generations of scholars and then the old guard of practitioners. But with Andre Arsenault, we now have spanned from 6 months to septuagenarians. So, and also, not only is this the youngest student of counterterrorism, but he's so remarkably well behaved. Really amazing. The main conclusion I've drawn thus far from the conference is you don't want to follow either Sir David or especially Christine Fair. So that's why I'm going to fall back on entertaining you with lurid photographs and forget about what I have to say. This presentation violates all the precepts of what I've taught my students in classes about briefings. And my only defense is next month I have to give a presentation to a very large audience. And even though I've always deluded myself into believing that every word I utter is a jewel valued beyond human computation, they actually told me we'd like to have some nice photographs with the talk. So this is my dry run of sorts. And I have to thank my research assistant, Joseph Bernard, for putting these photographs together. You know, we are, just as you've heard from Sir David and Christine, I mean, we're in a remarkably different place in terms of international terrorism than we were even 5 years ago. It's amazing to think that just a few years ago, every single senior leader in the United States intelligence community and our counterterrorism bureaucracy were all trumpeting the demise of al-Qaeda and the end of the Salafi jihadi threat. The tremendous success that our U.S. Navy SEALs had in killing bin Laden in Abbottabad in May 2011 set this off. Of course, this was followed off, especially by the exploitation of intelligence gained from his Abbottabad lair, with the killing of some 36 senior al-Qaeda officials, elimination of more than 200 of al-Qaeda's foot soldiers, the killing 3 months later of al-Qaeda's chief ideologue, and propagandist Anwar al-Awlaki. And of course, at that very moment was when the Arab Spring was unfolding across North Africa and the Middle East, and at least raised the possibility of a profound transformation of the socioeconomic and political structures and dimensions across those states that convinced many that civil disobedience, protest, the desire for democracy and economic reform had achieved what the terrorists had manifestly failed to deliver. One has to say how utterly and completely different it looks today. And for that, you don't have to listen to me. One just has to go back a couple of months ago to when the Director of National Intelligence, General Clapper, painted what was a remarkably bleak and melancholy picture of the state of the terrorist threat today. He first focused on al-Qaeda and its associates, and the statement that is such a profound vitiation of everything we hoped for 5 years ago is on the screen. Al-Qaeda and its affiliates, General Clapper stated, have proven resilient, right? They were supposed to be gone 5 years ago, and are positioned to make gains in 2016. That in and of itself is remarkable. They will continue to pose a threat to local, regional, and even possibly global interests. He then went on to focus on Daesh, ISIS, ISIL, where he described this movement as having become the preeminent terrorist threat because of its self-described caliphate in Syria and Iraq, its branches and emerging branches in other countries, and its increasing ability to direct and inspire attacks against a wide range of targets throughout the world. Well, there's a famous saying in Britain that a week is a long time in politics. Well, if a week is a long time in politics, 5 years must seem like an eternity in terms of terrorism. And just as Sir David described, in November we saw just how profound that was when there were 3 significant attacks, a massive truck bombing in Beirut, the in-flight downing of a Russian charter passenger aircraft that had moments before taken off from Sharm el-Sheikh in the Sinai, and then, of course, on November 13th, the tragedy in Paris. It's remarkably sobering to think that 2 years ago, the Islamic State did not exist. In fact, I was at a conference 23 months ago, that just up Massachusetts Avenue, that the Carnegie Endowment had in May 2014 on the Salafi jihadi terrorist threat. Not one of the panelists talked about ISIS, remarkably. So that's a huge change. Also, when one thinks of it, these were the two most serious terrorist attacks against a European city and against commercial aviation in more than a decade. And that in and of itself is significant on multiple levels. Firstly, both of those attacks against the airliner, the last one was 2004 against Russian flights taking off from Moscow, and of course the 2005 attacks on London. Firstly, very little to no warning of this dramatic escalation on ISIS's part. Secondly, the ringleader or the individual responsible for orchestrating the Paris attacks was at the time the most wanted man in Europe, but inexplicably was able to travel multiple times from Syria to France through Belgium, despite being the most wanted man. And then thirdly, these attacks did not conform to the prevailing analytical paradigm, at least within the United States, that, as Sir David had described, argued that ISIS would remain an entirely local threat confined to the perennially violent, unstable Middle East, and that ISIS had absolutely no desire to attack anywhere else. One's reminded of Winston Churchill's famous remark when Hitler had promised to invade Britain and wring Britain's neck, and he said in Parliament, some chicken, some neck. So we can see how bereft our analysis of ISIS was. And that in and of itself, I think, should suggest how little we actually understand the current threats and their evolution. And I say this because I think singularly depressingly, if bin Laden were alive today, he'd likely be a very happy man. And I say that because he'd likely have seen many of his profoundest dreams and hopes realized. In a very well-known 1998 interview he gave with a Pakistani journalist, bin Laden stated that he did not fear death, that in fact he welcomed his martyrdom. And the reason he said that is because he was confident that his death would produce thousands more Osamas. At the time in 2011, we didn't believe that. But think of the trajectory of foreign fighters that have emerged just within the past 9 months and how widely divergent and off even the most lavish estimates have been. Last summer, the U.S. intelligence community, at least in open source publications, put the number of about 20,000 of foreign fighters gravitating to Syria and Iraq. When the U.S. House of Representatives Committee on Homeland Security published its excellent report in October of last year, which of course counted the number of foreign fighters only up until September, that number had risen to 25,000. And when General Clapper testified before the Senate in February, he cited a figure of 36,500. So in this respect, bin Laden's dreams are being realized. And you see part of its manifestation. Al-Qaeda today, even while we believe that it was on the verge of strategic collapse and is on the verge of perhaps once again of strategic decline, is present in more places today than it was in 2008. Probably, I think, one could, despite many disagreements, you can say that there's about 17 key Al-Qaeda outposts throughout the world. That's double the number that there was in 2008. And by the way, we've been arguing that Al-Qaeda has been on the verge of strategic collapse for longer than it took the United States and Great Britain to defeat Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan during World War II. Not only has Al-Qaeda spread, but ISIS as well has established 8 different provinces or vilayets throughout the world, and at least according to a column that David Ignatius had in the Washington Post in March, has about 50 affiliates in some 21 different countries. So bin Laden's vision of a movement spreading and expanding, despite even his own demise, has obviously been realized. Secondly, we all have, well, I would say we all, many governments have very short memories when it comes to terrorism and counterterrorism. In September 2010, long forgotten, Bin Laden called upon his followers, called upon al-Qaeda's affiliates and associates to carry out Mumbai-style attacks across Western European cities. At the time, no one was capable of doing it. Al-Qaeda didn't have the assets. None of the affiliates or the associates had built up the logistical infrastructure or support networks to sustain those attacks. And of course, that's precisely what ISIS has delivered with the Paris attacks and now more recently with the attacks in Brussels. And then finally, if you remember from that thimble full of documents that was released in May 2012, the first tranche of what's called DocX, or the documents that were seized in bin Laden's lair in Abbottabad. One of those documents was enormously important, and a lot of hay was made out of it, that bin Laden was very worried about the longevity of the al-Qaeda brand. He was very concerned with the image that al-Qaeda was projecting. And many of us saw in that a desperation that bin Laden was trying to create a new brand that would have greater resonance, greater appeal. That has occurred as well. I mean, it's occurred in Syria. No one calls al-Qaeda's main organization in Syria al-Qaeda in Syria. We call it Jabhat al-Nusra, of course, and there's its flag. Salafi groups like Ahrar Sham, closely affiliated with al-Qaeda, have a completely different name. The Khorasan group, al-Qaeda's arguably special operations unit, forward deployed in Syria. So we see bin Laden has realized his other goal. We don't talk about al-Qaeda anymore. We use all these other nomenclatures, which has also resulted in some of our closest allies in the Middle East regarding those groups as more acceptable, more moderate, more palatable, and therefore worthy of support, in contrast to the more heinous ISIS. And then the other reason that bin Laden would be happy is that the strategy presented to him by one of his most loyal disciples, Saif al-Adil, al-Qaeda's longtime operations chief, in 2005, is actually being serially realized today. Now, I can't even see that, so I have to go over here. The first phase, Saif al-Adil, writing in 2005, he described as the awakening phase, which was meant to occur between 2000 and 2002 or 2003, and this was described again retrospectively as striking a blow at the head of the state, at the head of the snake in the United States, and hopefully fundamentally changing U.S. foreign and military policy. Now, don't forget, he was writing in 2005 retrospectively, so that's not a huge stretch, and you can tick that off. The second phase was the eye-opening phase, and that was meant to occur between 2003 and 2006, and would entail drawing United States and Western and apostate regional regimes, military forces into prolonged, enervating, debilitating overseas expeditions. Afghanistan and Iraq, you can check that off. Thirdly, you had from now we're getting into very different territory, because this is now Saif al-Adil in 2005 projecting forward. Because this third phase, the rising up and standing of the feet phase, was meant to begin in 2007. And this is where al-Qaeda would identify new sources for expansion and growth and begin to lay the foundations for that expansion. And again, going back to that first tranche of documents that was released in 2012, at least from my perspective, the second most interesting one was a document where in a memo from 2004, bin Laden muses that Nigeria would be an ideal ground for al-Qaeda expansion. And of course, during exactly this phase, we see the emergence and growth of Boko Haram. Then in the fourth phase, we have the expansion phase, which was meant to go from roughly 2010 to 2013. Remarkably, this phase continued despite Osama bin Laden's death. And the reason it continued is the Arab Spring. Just as the Arab Spring took everyone in the West by surprise, everybody across the region, certainly the dictators, by surprise, it also caught al-Qaeda off guard. But al-Qaeda was much more effective in recognizing the opportunity that the Arab Spring presented to it to once again become relevant, representing the opportunity of the chaos and upheaval, the release of over 2,000 jihadis from Egyptian jails, for example, for it to reconstitute its forces, and even despite bin Laden's death, was able to take advantage of the Arab Spring to reorient itself and to gain a foothold in the Levant in particular, but also elsewhere across the Middle East and North Africa. And then we come to the phase between 2013 and 2016, which Saif al-Adil in 2005 had described as the declaration of the caliphate stage. And this, to my mind, explains why Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the leader of ISIS, was so intent on declaring an Islamic State in June 2014 and launching his own struggle. He wanted to conform exactly to this blueprint. He wanted to steal al-Qaeda's lunch and implement this blueprint and position himself at the head of this movement, which is precisely what he did. So looking towards the future, we have from 2016 to 2020, the total confrontation stage. This Saif al-Adil envisioned would be a time when all the disparate affiliates and associates, franchises and vilayettes, branches and provinces would all rise up and come together, form a significant Islamist army that would finally be on the road to vanquishing all of its enemies. And then finally, in a very short period of time, from 2020 to 2022, you would have the total confrontation stage, where this Islamic army would achieve a decisive feat over its enemies, wherever they might be. And if you look at basically, the dates that are associated with those phases, that's the problem. They kind of dovetail with reality. Now, this is very important. I'm not arguing that al-Qaeda or the Salafi jihadi movement and ISIS are on the road to achieving this repugnant strategy. But that's the point. Propaganda doesn't have to be true. It just has to be believed. And I would argue that the ability of ISIS to steal and adhere to an al-Qaeda strategy has greatly facilitated its appeal and greatly enhanced the resonance of its message and al-Qaeda's message. Now, those of you who were at the St. Andrews Conference in September 2014 will remember that was actually the first paper that I talked about this. In my books, I prefer to use archival materials and go back in history, but my old friend and colleague from West Point, Brian Fishman, has a book coming out next month titled The War Plan, which is exactly about how ISIS and al-Qaeda are going about implementing the seven-stage strategy. From my perspective, al-Qaeda is weakened, but Zawahiri is pursuing a very shrewd, I think, strategy of sitting back, letting ISIS garner all the attention, distract all of our efforts, preoccupy our counterterrorism machinery, and then as we continue to be exhausted, al-Qaeda can emerge from the wings triumphant. And this is what, and you can't make it out, I don't think, because of the light, but that's bin Laden's ghost or shadow in the corner, again, thanks to Joe Bernard. This is the world that al-Qaeda and ISIS envision. This is exactly the caliphate with its names, Khorasan there, Hindustan, but this is their world sweeping from Andalus in Spain, across North Africa, through the Middle East, through the Caucasus, to South Asia, to Southeast Asia. So this is where they think the world will be in 2022. And the problem is, they have a strategy. We can debate how effective our strategy is in countering them. In that respect, too, I think one has to say, at least from my observations over the past 5 years, or longer, in fact, that the conventional wisdom on al-Qaeda and ISIS has very rarely been right and is less so today. First and foremost, proof positive is the argument that ISIS would be an entirely local threat and had no desire to strike anywhere outside of the Levant. Think about Libya. 2 years ago, there were no more than 500 ISIS fighters in Libya. Today, there's more than 10 times that number, an exponential growth. Also, just 2 years ago, inside the Beltway, the conventional wisdom and the prevailing notion is that ISIS's expulsion from al-Qaeda by al-Zawahiri would set in motion this fratricidal, internecine civil war that would ultimately neutralize both terrorist groups, or at least in this theme of wishful thinking, somehow result in their respective mutual self-immolations. This was a fundamental misreading of the history of terrorism, because what at least all students of terrorism and scholars of terrorism should know is that, at least historically, splits in terrorist organizations, at least in the short term, have produced more violence, not less. As the new group competes against its parent organization for recruits, exactly why ISIS has seized on social media and become so prominent in its recruitment, for resources, for money, and the coin of the realm in terrorism, of course, is violence. And this means that these groups have to become more violent, even more heinous, even more repugnant than their predecessors. And obviously, as Christine so vividly described, burning dudes in cages is just like, the tip of the spear of ISIS's depredations, which we could go to sex slaves, the genocidal campaigns being undertaken against Chaldeans, Yazidis, Sufis, anyone who opposes ISIS. And the wishful thinking was that both groups will disappear. Well, given that the wishful thinking and the conventional wisdom has never been right, I think the most likely outcome is the one that we refuse to accept and that we dismiss now as completely unlikely. And that's a reamalgamation or a reunification of al-Qaeda and ISIS. And I think there's at least 4 good reasons why this will occur. There's a more lengthy exegesis of this on Foreign Affairs Online. But the first one is, they actually have the same ideology. There's absolutely no difference in their ideologies. The difference is in style and substance. I mean, al-Qaeda sort of has a superego in terrorism, and ISIS is all about the id. Right? They're unconstrained. They both embrace the same strategy, which is my argument that ISIS has stolen al-Qaeda's strategy and is intent on implementing it. Thirdly, the differences that really exist are the personality clash between Zawahiri and al-Baghdadi. To this day, ISIS still venerates and respects Osama bin Laden as the true leader of the movement. In fact, they style themselves and see themselves as the true embodiment of bin Laden's vision, and as Zawahiri is an incompetent and is as an imposter. So what this means is that their rivalry is predicated more on a personal enmity between these two individuals than anything else. And one has to also understand that these two individuals are perhaps the most, hunted and sought after persons in the entire world. The elimination of one or the other or of both, I think would actually, clear the decks for an historic compromise of, I think, unprecedented implications. And the problem with ISIS, even more so, is that Baghdadi claims that he's entitled to be caliph because of his familial lineage descending back to the Prophet. So it's not even clear that there would be a designated successor that would command the respect and allegiance of ISIS fighters. Also, too, it doesn't have to be voluntary. It doesn't have to be a willing amalgamation. There could be a forced takeover. And in fact, already on at least one occasion, and I would probably say more than one, but one significant occasion, in December 2014, there was actually an attempt at a forced amalgamation. I mean, one could also idly speculate what exactly are Jabhat al-Nusra and the Khorasan group up to in Syria. I mean, I think I could argue one of their main roles is to wait in the wings for the opportunity to take over and seize control of ISIS and forcibly amalgamate it. So, some conclusions and some policy solutions. Firstly, from my perspective of having studied terrorism now for a very long time, and Sir David talked about this as well, we're talking about a threat now that is becoming much more complex, much more variegated, and much more difficult to defeat. We're no longer, when we're talking about ISIS, Jabhat al-Nusra, al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, we're not necessarily talking about pure terrorist groups, but we're talking about entities that embody the characteristics of terrorist groups, of guerrilla warriors, of insurgents, and of irregular military forces with conventional military capabilities. And of course, this was absolutely pivotal when ISIS stormed into Iraq in June and July of 2014. It's also been pivotal to al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula's seizure of territory. So firstly, we're seeing groups that are more hybrid forces and aren't strict terrorist groups. This has enormous complications. Special forces and direct action commando raid, very effective against terrorist groups. Against irregular hybrid forces that have conventional capabilities, you're talking about a larger footprint than sometimes we want to admit. Secondly, the problem is many of these groups are militarily far more capable than their local counterparts of established nation states. Whether it's al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, the al-Nusra Front, or ISIS, I mean, they have thus far acquitted themselves in battle far better than their state enemies, unless they've been supported by external assistance. And that's another important point. Nowhere that any ISIS or al-Qaeda element has ever seized territory and controlled population have they been dislodged decisively and significantly without outside intervention. Thirdly, as also Sir David described, the Arab Spring, despite its many promises, had a remarkably destabilizing effect on the countries throughout North Africa and the Middle East. This stabilization, this upheaval, the change in government, the weakening, in fact, sometimes not necessarily a bad thing in the case of repressive domestic security and intelligence services, but nonetheless, this has given greater space and presented greater opportunities to terrorist groups in that region. Sanctuary and safe haven has become really the coin of the realm for these groups. 30 years ago, then Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher had said that publicity is the oxygen that terrorists depend upon. That was a very 20th century formulation. In the 21st century, I would argue that access to sanctuary and safe haven, the exploitation of weak and failing governments, the ability to move into the seam zones, the lawless border areas between states, is exactly what sustains and enables terrorism to continue and, unfortunately, to thrive. We have to also take a hard look at how we've been countering this threat. Countering violent extremism, the non-kinetic approaches, don't seem to have borne very much fruit when you've got 36,500 fighters. And that's just the fighters going to Syria and Iraq. There's also foreign fighters today being trained and traveling to Afghanistan, Pakistan, Yemen, Libya, and Mali. Without exception, all of our efforts to train up the local forces have failed. So we definitely need a new approach in that respect. One way to begin is rolling back ISIS and retaking Western Iraq. We've been promising that Mosul would fall for nearly 2 years now. I don't see anything in sight that suggests it will. As long as ISIS is able to retain what it regards as the three capitals of its caliphate, of its axis, Mosul, Raqqa, and Sirte, its allure, its attraction, its propaganda will be undiminished. Also, in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, the international community was extremely effective in undermining the terrorist infrastructure throughout the world. Its ability to move men, and especially its ability to generate finances and move money. That has pretty much eroded. Al-Qaeda could not exist today if it was not able to exploit means to move men and money across the Middle East and across South Asia. ISIS could not survive if it was not unable to tap into the black and gray markets in the region and to still raise revenue, not only from the sale of oil, but the sale of electricity, and indeed the trafficking in inequities. This entails not just building up, and Sir David was right on target here as well. It's not just a matter, I would add to what he said, it's not just a matter of capacity and capability, it's a matter of political will, where we have to understand the dimensions of this threat and our failure to check it thus far. In my view, the most important measure of effectiveness, which is a huge debate within government, within the military, how do we assess progress in this struggle? From my perspective, the most important measure of effectiveness is rolling back the proliferation of franchises, branches, affiliates, and associates. Until we start to constrict that environment, whether it's ISIS or whether it's Al-Qaeda, they will continue to have an attraction and an allure to fighters from throughout the world. And then finally, Even though the word, the long war, was banished from the Pentagon 11 years ago, we have to accept that as exactly the struggle that we're in. Our enemies are already radicalizing the next generation. We are already in a situation that General Clapper described, where foreign fighters from 100 countries throughout the world, that's more than half of the globe's countries, have gravitated to the fights in the Middle East, in North Africa, and in South Asia. So we have to realize that this is not a war that is going to be over in the next presidential administration or even two, but it's a generational struggle. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Bruce. We've had 3 wonderful presentations, all of them deeply optimistic about the future. So what I'm going to do now, the session began slightly late, so I'm going to take the liberty of running it on until 12:15 and having time for opportunity to discuss if that's okay. So I'm going to throw it open now to questions. Who will start us with a question or comment? Yes, please.
Thank you. My name is Tom Dickinson. I'm a security studies alumnus. I have a very basic question on terminology. Is there any difference in the use of ISIL, ISIS, or Daesh in terms of inference or implication or connotation?
Thank you.
And you remember like how George Bush 41 always used to say Saddam Hussein because Saddam sounded like a dirty word in Arabic.
Right.
Yeah.
So any difference in the use of those terms?
I'd like to hear from all 3. I'll start with Bruce on that.
Well, Sir David and I were discussing this just before the conference. I think that it's become policy not to say ISIS or ISIL because Islamic State is in it, and one doesn't want to give them the credibility that they do not deserve, and therefore Daesh, a nickname, is seen as much more pejorative. I agree with the sentiment. I think in practice it doesn't really work because, firstly, ISIS is easier to say. I mean, even though, and Richard and I were talking about this, it was the name of a river where we both went to university, a much beloved river, but it just flows better. But, ISIS is the Islamic State in Iraq and Asham, and Asham means the Levant, basically. It's the Arabic word, the edge. So that's why you get ISIL, which is the Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant. But I think that almost gives them too much credit. They're certainly in Syria, but they're not in Lebanon as well. And that, I think, accounts for the nomenclature and the differences. And, just to make terrorism even more complex and confusing than it already is, we call the same group by multiple names. And also, you forgot IS. Many people also call it just the Islamic State.
Christine.
It's the Arab acronym.
It's the Arabic acronym.
Christine, do you want to talk about the nomenclature of ISIS?
No, Bruce just did it.
Okay, David.
I mean, very brief. The dictionary of, I think, IS simply, the state, is regarded in some quarters as giving a greater credibility because although this is claimed to be a state, a caliphate, it is not yet. It does not enjoy the trappings. It's unlikely to join the United Nations in that community sense. So I think there's a negative political dimension to just IS. IS, as Bruce has mentioned, I mean, either that implies the Levant or Sham, the greater Syria. I think the danger of that for us as counter-terrorists is that I think it got us into a bit of a cul-de-sac about thinking of this threat as regional to what, as I say in my comments, what used to be Syria and Iraq in their post-Sykes-Picot manifestation. Whereas, in fact, I think this threat is much broader than that, as I think tragic events have underlined. And therefore, if we think about Syria and Iraq, or what used to be Syria and Iraq, and we think about airstrikes as being the answer and have a big argument about ground troops, yes or no, we're not actually addressing the totality of the problem. So that's where I think the hang-up is with ISIS and ISIL. Daesh, I think, has the advantage that this is a Middle Eastern and in part Arabic phenomenon. So I think using Arabic might be an interesting beginning. And it is a derogatory, pejorative term in Arabic. So it is used predominantly throughout the Middle East in order to undermine the group which is inflicting a great deal of harm on many more citizens in the Middle East than it is in the West. So that's why I think that's the dictionary.
Thank you, David.
Can I ask you a quick question?
Yeah.
I heard you said this repeatedly. What does you said it means something pejorative in Arabic?
Yeah, we can give you the full title. Yeah.
Well, I know it's an acronym.
Yeah.
But you said it's pejorative.
Yes.
Is it? So is it? What is it?
In terms of a nickname, Christine, or using a group in a sense of almost taking the mickey out of the group, or criticism.
Well, just calling it by its acronym takes the Mickey out of them.
Yeah.
Okay, I guess that. Okay.
Well, it
Okay.
deprives them of their pretensions to being a state. That I think
okay.
is that's it.
Oh, I see.
So
I
referring
see.
to them as a sports team, or as a
I gotcha.
or as a
Yes.
clothing brand.
I'm going to bring in a couple of people from the audience. Can the microphone come to Hijab here? Thanks.
My understanding is also that Daesh in Arabic translates to something like the one that is crushed.
Yeah.
And so there was, I believe a little while ago, there was kind of this announcement made by Daesh leaders saying if this term is used, whoever uses this term is going to get punished for it.
Yeah.
So I think that the pejorative element, that comes into play as well.
They certainly don't like it. Yeah, right.
Thank you. Yeah, there. Thank you very much.
Hi, I'm Laura Donahue, Georgetown Law. Nice to see you. Nice to see Bruce. So Bruce, I want to challenge you a little bit on your statement that the ability to move to the seams is more important than publicity, and kind of the 80s interpretation of publicity being the oxygen. And here I'm just going kind of traditional Schmidt and Youngman, there's different targets, right? There's the immediate target, and to get that immediate target, you might need safe houses and movement, as you're pointing out. But if you look at the awakening that you put up as the first stage, that was about publicity. And you need to have that publicity for ISIS. Some of these more dramatic acts actually still depend upon that publicity. So I'm a little bit skeptical of your claim that that's not the most important thing. It might be important for one of the targets, but certainly for the target audience, you actually need to still have that publicity. And then a second point, and this goes to Sir David, as well as to Bruce. Bruce, you mentioned that AQAP, ISIS, et cetera, they're capable as regional militaries, and al-Nusra you mentioned. My question is, are they capable as governments? So you said they'll never take their place, Sir David, amongst the civilized world as nations. Can they actually govern? And here I think of Mitchell McLaughlin and the Army Council and the IRA, where he was, he couldn't conceive of actually governing and what they would do as a government. And so they might be capable as regional militaries, but is this something that will collapse later because of their inability to actually govern? So that map that you put up made it seem as though they were much bigger than they actually are. They might have strongholds here and that they're militarily defending. That's very different than governing a caliphate.
Thank you, Laura. Bruce first, then David?
Yep.
Sure. Well, I mean, you're right about the publicity, and I was actually collapsing a much broader thought. I mean, when Margaret Thatcher talked about publicity, it was that you could somehow choke it off by somehow depriving terrorists of their access to mass media and commercial media. I mean, terrorists today don't need that. I mean, they have their own social media in particular, so they can communicate their message very easily and aren't dependent on any kind of an intermediary. But their survival, I think, and their attraction is much less from their publicity than from their ability to do what terrorist groups traditionally and historically have not been able to do, which is seize and hold territory. Now, this is your second question. I think you're quite right that whether ISIS can function indefinitely as a state is certainly a matter of profound debate. And you're right that it's not a continuous swath. Even across Iraq and Syria, it's not a continuous swath. But the point is, I think, as long as they firstly can challenge local conventional militaries and win, that enhances their power. And then, in essence, it's like, it's the conundrum about terrorism. The longer they're able to survive and avoid being beaten, the greater their power, the more enhanced their attraction is to people. And that, I think, has played a pivotal role that we don't quite understand in the case of ISIS. And that's led us to things like countering violent extremism and war of ideas. Hasn't worked. I mean, the number of foreign fighters is increasing, not declining, even if the number in the past month is off in Syria, largely because of events in Syria. I mean, I would argue it's because we also fundamentally misunderstand ISIS's appeal. And as you know, I've written extensively on the nexus between terrorism and religion, but I think ISIS is appealing to people on a much more visceral and much more basic level, that it almost harkens back to Frantz Fanon and The Wretched of the Earth, that its violence is cathartic, it's self-empowering, there's a self-satisfying blow. And by having these territories and by controlling these seam zones, it's able to provide venues where people can go and train and actually carry out, and also there's other sorts of benefits, the sex slaves and things like that, but can actually realize these fantasies, that they've made them very accessible. And the trouble is, even if none of these, none of these pockets of their presence is contiguous or in and of themselves is terribly powerful, they're also enormously difficult to eliminate, and and that was my point, they provide more the beacon, I would say, than just the publicity and attention of yesteryear. This is now a tangible manifestation of these groups.
David?
Very briefly. I don't exclude any possibility. I am old enough now to have achieved a position as a counter-terrorist where I've contributed to the career of many murderers who are now leading successful and rewarding careers as part of a political process. So I think we're doomed to recognize that that is part of the reality. I think my point in terms of avoiding the word state for the caliphate at the moment is that I don't think it is displaying the short-term capability, although there is some real politique on the ground. As Bruce has highlighted, this wouldn't be happening in the total absence of a degree of at least compliance. Acceptance might be too strong a word, but I mean there doesn't appear to be the immediate prospect. I think. And it goes back to the point I was making about the contribution of the thinking community, not only terrorism study, but law and elsewhere. Here you've got this great balance, potentially. Is it a wise strategy for us to really expose the deficiencies of the claim to be a state by making clear just how badly they're doing this, and they're actually visiting misery on thousands of people? Or do we choose a policy of embracing the group and leading to a rightful place amongst the community of nations? My own inclination would be to the former rather than the latter. But I mean, it's part of the debate that we're not having about the grand strategic direction.
Thank you. Next question was here. Yes, thank you.
Good morning. Tom Nagel. I'm from U.S. Special Operations Command. Professor Hoffman, I wanted to ask you about one of your concluding points. You mentioned that one of the most important indicators was going to be the prevention of the proliferation of franchises, especially given the answer that you just gave about the appeal of things outside of the ideological side. I don't know if you envision that as a direct set of activities or if that was simply an indicator of other activities, but I think there's a growing interest in special operations about this prevention of opportunity. So how do you kind of envision that prevention of franchises, given the other factors that play into that? How do you prevent those types of franchises from popping up?
Yeah, I don't have a good answer to that because I don't think we understand how these franchises are emerged, and we don't understand, for instance, the paradox of Tunisia, which is probably the only country that's emerged from the Arab Spring with any semblance of a reformed state, but yet has furnished the largest numbers of foreign fighters to ISIS. No, my point is that our current metrics are off. And the other metric that I glossed over is the decapitation one, which also is not, I mean, many people can disagree with my briefing, and that's certainly valid. But my argument would be decapitation isn't working, countering violent extremism isn't working, and our training up of local forces is failing abysmally. We need a completely new approach. I don't know what that approach is. It's a completely different strategy, and it's predicated on a change in political will, which certainly during the presidential election period I don't think is going to happen. It will depend, when a new government comes to power. I mean, is it creating, as John Nagel has argued, an advisory expeditionary corps of some 20,000 people? It may well be. I actually think that CVE and the non-kinetics work better after you've broken the back or defeated the terrorist organizations, and that's one of the problems I see here, is we're trying to address a supply problem when there's this tremendous attraction by these groups. I mean, my strategy, although I don't think it's going to be implemented, is I think it's absurd to think that the Iraqi security forces or any indigenous Yemeni military force is going to be capable of dislodging these groups. In the case of Iraq, I think This is completely politically unpalatable, but you need some Western expeditionary force that can go in and take Mosul, but then train the Iraqi security forces to provide the stability and the sustainment of normal governance in life. I mean, that is within their capability. We learned the hard way in Iraq in particular how difficult urban warfare is, but that's something the U.S. military is highly skilled at. And it took successive besiegements of cities in Iraq to do so. So we're expecting the Iraq security forces basically to go from 0 to 60 degrees in a short period of time. It's not going to happen. So it's going to require some outside intervention. Better to have a different idea of training, not training them in urban warfare, but training them to provide the security and sustenance that's needed afterwards. But accepting we may have to be the hammer that is used first, or some other Western force. But, you know, at a time, I don't want to disparage our British guests at all by saying this, but at a time when the United States Marine Corps, the smallest of our combat services, is larger than the entirety of the UK military, when the Japanese Navy, which is a pacifistic Navy, is larger than the Royal Navy. I mean, this isn't to criticize Britain, but just to show that our go-to partner for the past decade and a half, I mean, much like, you know, the diminution of the United States Army as well, of losing 100,000 troops. None of us are as capable as we were a decade or a decade and a half ago against a threat that was much more limited, that was geographically focused in one and then two places, but it was basically one group. And now we have a much more geographically diverse group with at least two main enemies, and we have diminished resources and, of course, a much reduced political will as well.
David.
I mean, I think what you're asking is a really important question, but I think there are seeds of hope within it. I think the reflection is that we happen to be in an era where conflicts which might have been resolved more expeditiously in previous years and in previous experience have endured much longer than one otherwise might have expected. Somalia, of course, is the classic example. We can add in Yemen, we can add in Libya. I mean, there are a variety around the world. My seeds of hope is that in many ways our failure to address these conflicts over a protracted period of years is not necessarily the natural state of the post-Second War world, where resolution has been found, political will has been more evident on a broader scale, the Security Councils work better, international and regional organizations have worked more effectively, and we've been able to resolve those issues, or indeed to prevent them getting worse, because I think the added problem of what we've got with unaddressed conflict zones around the world is that the longer they've been neglected, the more difficult they are to retrench and to gain, and you were making the point, Bruce, about reasonable peace building and a recovery to something like approaching normality. So I think the opportunity of the international community to address, peace building, prevention of decline into conflict, shortening the span between acute difficulty and some sort of groping road to recovery, I mean, is an enormous factor. I think, sadly, we don't have that recognition within the global political community, if I can, sadly, in terms of commitment, understanding, and leadership, and we don't currently enjoy the functioning organizations. For example, just to close, the way that the Security Council has become hamstrung because of the way that China and Russia felt that the West had behaved abysmally in relation to Libya and had abused a Security Council resolution from which they abstained, and then, in their view, went on to become the conquering nation. Sadly, as we know now, not very effectively. So I think what you're highlighting is in my panoply of things that we could be doing around strategy, and that's why I'm pleased to see it on Bruce's list, because I think, and it's actionable, I think.
And we'll have a chance to discuss aspects of international cooperation in this afternoon's session as well. The next question was here. Yes, the gentleman there. Thank you.
Morning. My name is Ted Kenyon. I'm a student in the program. My question is for Dr. Fair. You described Pakistan as a grassroots population problem. My question is, how do you think the Pakistani population is going to respond to the information revolution, increases in communication? Ideally, it's a democratizing technology. Do you see the massive population moving towards radicalism because of this, or is there any hope for Western liberal democracy?
All right, so this is where I have a different philosophy about the word radicalize. I don't, in my work, use it. I'm a South Asianist, so I don't know if my views on this topic have resonance in other regions. But I will say, in my work on Lashkar-e-Taiba, they're recruiting just like my brothers recruit. We would never say the U.S. Army radicalized my brothers when they signed at 17. But they did sign at 17. We wouldn't. And so when I look at Lashkar-e-Taiba, they are selling a mission. And whether we like it or not, the people that are joining support that mission in the same way that our men and women sign up for service. It's a very professionalized recruitment organization. And let me give you a little bit of an example. My little brother, Pork is his nickname, pusillanimous as they come, yet the U.S. Army trained him to kill, right? And so we need, when I look at these groups, I abjure the use of that word, because when we use it, we stop thinking of the members as rational actors. We stop engaging what it is that they do, why they do it, how they do it, and more importantly, what are the resources with which the recruiters go after them. When I was at RAND, I spent a lot of time working on military personnel issues. So this way of thinking comes very natural to me. Plus, I hang out, whenever I go to Indiana, which is often, I hang out exclusively with recruiters. And I'm really struck by how similar these organizations are. They're manning a mission, right? So going to your bigger point, what I have seen, and hijab is here, and so I encourage a conversation with hijab. I think when Americans think about democratizing technology, we think of civil society as being liberal. What I've observed in Pakistan in particular is that civil society is not civil. And the reason is that you have to understand the infrastructure of Pakistan. If you use the very generous statistics that the government publishes, about 60% of the men are literate, lower literacy rates for women. Literacy is often defined as, can you sign your name? That's not really what literacy is, right? You have places where electricity is only available 1 hour a day. So you actually have a problem that this isn't going to happen overnight, that Pakistanis are going to have access to this technology. The groups that do have access to this technology, Jamaat al-Dawa, all of the terrorist groups, are very present on social media. When Salman Taseer was killed because he dared to say that Pakistan's blasphemy law should be reformed and that a Christian woman should not be killed, and by the way, there's a real debate about whether or not non-Muslims can commit blasphemy. The supporters of his murderers came out all over on social media. They completely swamped the voices of sanity, right? So I think this idea that, I'm going to give you another piece of data. Americans have this idea that people who support democracy will somehow not support terrorism. Now, I've got data. I have a lot of data on Pakistan. My colleagues and I have done very large surveys. Here's the bummer for you, sir. The people who most support democracy are the biggest supporters of groups like Lashkar-e-Taiba. Now, I wasn't surprised by that. In fact, I won a bet on this. I said, dude, I know how this result's going to roll. The democracy lovers are going to be the terrorist lovers. And the reason is, what these groups are selling is in Urdu azadi, which means independence. They are liberating Muslims from the tyranny of a hegemonic Hindu rule. Now, that sounds pretty damn good if you're a democracy lover, right? So, on the other hand, groups that did not have a democracy argument or an azadi component, by the way, same thing with the Afghan Taliban. Democracy lovers love the Afghan Taliban. Their message resonates with democracy lovers. The anti-sectarian groups, the primary public service that they deliver is killing apostates. The democracy lovers were less inclined to support them. So where I'm going with this is, I can give you a very similar breakdown of how economic opportunities and education opportunities, some educated people like terrorism more than others. In fact, in our work in Pakistan, the people who dislike the terrorists the most are poor, they live in cities, right? So completely opposite of what we're thinking about. The other thing I'm going to say, and I'm going to shut up, is that when we talk about the target market, and if you know any military recruiters, they're going to tell you the same thing as I'm about to tell you. We always think of military-age men as a target market for our CVE, for our kinetic activities. I hate to say it, ladies are the problem. In Pakistan, ladies are the problem. Survey after survey. Just by virtue of being a dude, you are significantly less likely to support terrorists. Now, what does this mean? By the way, this is not true in Bangladesh, right? So this idea that women are peacemongers ain't necessarily so. My brothers would tell you that. I'm not a peacemonger. But why are women a particular problem in Pakistan? Well, the terrorist groups like Jamaat al-Dawa, they figured this out. They empower women in the way in which ordinary society doesn't. When you become a member of Jamaat al-Dawa's Women's League, you get to roam around freely. I remember when I was a student in Pakistan back in the 90s, I hung out with these nuns. The nuns actually said the same thing. They converted from Islam, which is illegal in Pakistan, to be a Catholic, because by being a nun, they escaped the tyranny of domestic production. And by running around in the nun suit, they could do whatever they wanted to do. No one questioned them. Now, those days are gone for nuns. They're now targeted. But in the same way that nuns were liberated through this organization, members of Lashkar-e-Taiba's women group, they are basically local politicians. They are a big deal. And the sick thing is, the more sons you've had that died, the more influence you have. So there's a hierarchy. There's the mothers of Shaheed, there's the mothers of Ghazis, in other words, soldiers who went off and fought and came back, and then there's people that aspire to be the mother of a Shaheed, right? So all this is to say, democracy and the IT revolution is probably not going to work out, at least in Pakistan, the way the promoters of these ideas might think it will. Now, I would like,
Thank you, Chris.
Hijab might have a countervailing view.
Hijab, do you want to come in on this? Nuns and terrorism? No? No. Maybe over lunch, if you rather, but because I think you would have things which would be of high value in the conversation. Next question, but there was a question there. Yep. No, you heard your hand up here. Yeah, yes. I'm trying to go in the order in which people caught my eye because I'm...
Sorry. One thing I want to say is that years ago in a previous administration, an official accused Marines, U.S. Marines, of being extremists. And we said, thank you. We are extremists. That's the job we do. And that's how you recruit people into the Marine Corps. Nobody goes into the Marine Corps to have a good time, especially in boot camp.
Thank you. Thank you for that. I totally agree with you. Yep.
The other thing is, I've noticed since 2011, we've switched away from all this. We're building a military that's almost totally conventional now. We're buying unbelievably expensive bombers. I was in London last summer for a couple of weeks. They were going crazy because we announced over there we're spending $1 trillion to build new nuclear weapons production facilities in the next 15 years. We're building fighters that cost $150 million apiece. The Marine Corps is getting them. We're going in all kinds of stuff. We're building a larger conventional force that is unrelated to counterterrorism. We're getting rid of all the stability operations programs. We're going the other way. How does that work out? What are we going to do now?
Could you pass this down?
Bruce?
Well,
All right, thanks.
those are very good points, and actually it goes back to what I was saying a minute ago. Rather than my coming across as a warmonger or as wedded to violent solutions to things, I think in the recent years we've lost sight of exactly what the strategy of our enemies are. I mean, terrorism is all about waging a war of attrition. Whether it's ISIS or Al-Qaeda, Lashkar-e-Taiba, whatever it is, all of these groups understand that they do not have the firepower or the numbers to defeat, it's not least the United States' military, but any actually well-trained, well-organized, doctrinally proficient military force. And that's not what they're trying to do. They're trying to undermine our will. They're trying to turn liberal societies illiberal, causing them to be xenophobic, causing them to turn on their own values, undermining confidence in political leadership, which in the West these days seems to be, unfortunately, growing rather than declining. And unfortunately, by the way we've chosen to fight terrorism in recent years, we're falling into their trap. We're waging a war of attrition. If you're going to fight terrorism, do it decisively. And then have prepared exactly the means, like countering violent extremism, economic reform, stabilization, to prevent the resurgence of terrorism. But we've almost put the cart before the horse. And we're convinced, despite the spread that I've depicted on maps and on slides and everything, that we can roll this back exclusively non-kinetically. I mean, that's part of the problem, is we go from one extreme to the other. We go from invading countries and not having a Phase 4 plan to doing everything that's non-kinetic and forgetting that at some point you have to physically and kinetically diminish the military power of your enemies. But the way we're doing now ensures that this will be a generational struggle. It ensures that it's imposing on us precisely the costs that the terrorists want to impose on us, to weaken us, to cause us to turn on ourselves, and so on.
Bruce, so I have a question for you, and also for you, because I think you and I are kind of on the same plane. I don't know how to put this delicately. When I look at the insurgencies that have been decisively defeated, like let's take the Khalistan insurgency, let's look at the defeat of the Tamil Tigers, Chechnya II, even Malaya, the so-called successful one, required concentration camps. These all required massive depopulation. I've argued my issue with the Afghan counterinsurgency approach is that it would require us to massively depopulate Pashtun males, right? India got away with it in the Punjab. We're still finding mass graves, which is an issue because Sikhs are supposed to be immolated. They're supposed to be cremated when they die. We're still finding mass graves of Tamil Tigers, the same thing, they're supposed to be cremated. Is it possible within our country, we're different. We're not going to, we mothers and fathers would not support their sons going out and engaging in mass depopulations. How do we win within the constraints of international humanitarian law? The victors of this have all been massive IHL violators.
Well, you know...
Am I wrong? I mean,
no, you're not wrong. And you're raising, I think, one of the most intellectually disputatious and emotionally, riveting debates. I mean, I maintain, and I'm sure there's people in this room who will both agree and disagree with me, we got it right in Iraq between 2007 and 2010. And we did all of that. We did it because, firstly, it was not just a matter of the Sunni uprising, but that was absolutely pivotal in giving the population an incentive to invest in their own security, protecting that population, which was absolutely pivotal, and absolutely pivotal to why everything is unraveled in Iraq under Maliki and the sectarianism. And we did that twofold. I mean, firstly, we had the Joint Special Operations Command that unrelentingly dismantled the terrorist infrastructure there. Even the Iranian terrorist infrastructure, which no one talking, even in my slides, as bad as I think the world is, I didn't even get into the so-called ITN, the Iranian terrorist network, which is big and is growing too, and is spreading. But we don't want to completely depress people. But we did it, and we had the conventional forces there that could provide that security. And there was the political reform.
Most of those enemies, though, in Iraq were foreign. They weren't, many of them, the Al-Qaeda folks, there was the big dudes were foreign.
But even
and
now.
So does that matter? Like Lashkar, for example, the Khalistanis were all domestic. You had a few Canadians, you had a few Brits, but the bulk of them, the vast majority, were Indian. The Tamil Tigers, the vast majority of whom. Does it matter that when you have fewer people to kill?
I don't know, because
I
each
feel
of these
terrible
are so...
asking this, but...
No, each of them are different. I mean, in the case of the Tamil Tigers, the Sri Lankan Armed Forces had 30 years of complete fecklessness, corruption, inability. It was only when Sarath Fonseca became chief of staff. And also there was a generation of officers that had grown up seeing the false promises of truces. When Rajapaksa gave them the green light, they were just going to take it. Of course, I mean, but that can't be a model, because they completely excluded any foreign reporting of what went on. They vitiated all the principles, not just of counterinsurgency, but of humanitarian warfare. So there's indirect fire constantly directed against civilian enclaves.
And the Indians did that in Khalistan, the Russians did it in Chechnya.
But, I mean,
But they
You know,
won.
all I want is a positive step that diminishes ISIS's allure and power, which I believe is taking Western Iraq. And then I'm willing to build from there. So that's really all I'm talking about, even in the last slides. I mean, the problem of Syria is much more complex. But we need, I think, that important step forward of inflicting on them a decisive defeat. That will accomplish much more than countering violent extremism, than even training up local forces.
Thank you, Bruce. David, you wanted to come in on this question of...
30 seconds, if I may. Your issue of conventional and unconventional military assets. 3 quick points. I think what we've learnt since 2001 is that the military are not the totality of the response, but I would say they remain enormously important. And I think the closer we get to a convergence of what we've described as war, civil war, insurgency, terrorism, the more important that is. And just one final point, I think the military provide a unique contribution in terms of the intellectual bridge between what we learn of counterterrorism overseas and what we learn of counterterrorism in the homeland. And they're perhaps the only part of our public sector dimension that has that intellectual insight which can inform both overseas and homeland. I think that's important.
Thank you, David. Just a second, we're going to have to continue the conversation over lunch. I know that there are other questions and comments, but the sign of a great gig is that people want to have more than there's time for. So what I'm going to do is, at 1:30, we're going to reconvene for the next session, and David may have some things to say about that. But before he does, I'd just like you to thank, with me, our panelists for excellent presentations and also wonderful engagement with wonderful questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Yes, I think we all agree this conversation has to continue. So we're going to do that over lunch. It is downstairs. The elevator is right outside, 2 floors down, or the stairs. You can just see it over the railing. I would like to just say one thing to take MC's prerogative here. I think what Bruce laid out for the strategy there is a very sophisticated unconventional warfare strategy being executed by ISIS and Al-Qaeda. I think it's interesting to note that the Congress recognized the need for a countering unconventional warfare strategy to be written. And the National Defense Authorization Act of 2016, Section 1097, actually calls for that. And so I'm really interested to see if we will get a strategy that Bruce calls for, because that is an unconventional warfare strategy that's being executed by ISIS and Al-Qaeda. So please join us for lunch downstairs, and as Richard said, we'll reconvene here at 1:30. Thank you.